We'll get this guy rolling here.
I even muted you, Don.
That is fantastic. Okay.
Do you want me to start sharing first, or just
Yeah, please. Yeah, go ahead and start sharing, Scott. That'd be great. Okay, we want to welcome everybody to the 2021 Virtual Christmas Summit, brought to you by Boscoyo Studio. This presentation is sponsored by xLights. Please don't unmute or interrupt the presenter at any time. Feel free to put any questions or discussion in the chat. We'll try to answer them as we go along. Today's presentation is going to be delivered by Scott Hansen. Scott Hansen is one of the developers of xLights. He's going to discuss the integration of controllers. Scott is a stand-up guy, and his knowledge is invaluable to our community. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scott Hansen.
Thanks, Don. So I'm Scott. I have my website down here below, scott@scottnation.com, if you want to check that out ever. I have information about my show, and I put all my slides up there too, so if you ever want to go back and see them. Kind of what I want to go over today is just some of the features that xLights has for different controllers, how we can use these features to our advantage to kind of make it as easy as possible to get your controllers configured and not have to worry too much about manually and everything like that. So about me, I'm Scott from Grand Rapids, Michigan here. I started doing lights, animated lights in 2017, at least pixels. I've been doing other lights for a long time. I've been contributing / developing for xLights since 2017. I started that same year. If you ever see questions or anything, if you make an issue on GitHub and you see Computer Geek 1507, that's me. So if you see that and just respond, that's me. My day job is a software / electronics engineer. I work in PCB manufacturing, and I do other things like home automation, 3D printing, 3D design, all the nerdy stuff. And there's a self-portrait if you want to know what I look like. So what I want to go over is controller integration in xLights. So the main thing in xLights is we have like controller upload, which allows you to set up your props and settings in xLights, and then xLights will push that config to the controller. So that's the first thing I want to kind of show. It'll upload your universes, your start channels, your input-output settings. But then I also want to talk about some other integrations custom to specific controllers, how we can upload with FPP Connect, how we can generate FSCQs for the Falcon for standalone mode, and how we can generate FSCQs for the HinksPix controller as well. So the most basic thing I want is controller integration. So there's a lot of information here that you probably won't understand, but not all integrations are equal. So some controllers, they have what we call an API, which basically is a mode in the controller where software can upload settings and can upload the parameters to the controller through a special backend designed for software. And this is a lot better for xLights because normally there's feedback, there's kind of settings, there's this design protocol that we establish, so it's a lot less error prone and a lot better. So the FPP, the Falcon, the Avitec, and the ESP, they all have an API. So
hey, Scott,
those are kind of like the better integrations.
Scott, can you change your mic? You're really breaking up bad. If it's possible.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Just to help.
I guess Bluetooth is not the way to go.
Also, if you have videos playing for your profile, please stop your video share as well.
Can you hear me on this mic? Is this any better?
Yeah, a thousand times better.
Okay, we'll go with this. So, sorry about that. Now, I'm gonna forget how to go back in PowerPoint because I'm terrible at PowerPoint. Okay, so sorry about that. I guess I'll just start here again. Hopefully you didn't miss too much. If not, we can go over it later. So I want to talk. So when we have integrations that are API based, those are better for the controller, or that's better for xLights because we actually have a distinguished protocol or a link that the software can use that is specifically written for other software. So for these controllers like FPP and for Falcon and for Avitech and the ESP Pixel sticks, there's actually like a software API that's designed that xLights can use, and it's more redundant and it's more safe. Like we can get feedback, and if we do something wrong, it'll actually give us better feedback. So those types of controllers are actually the better integrations into xLights. The other controllers like the SanDevice, J1Sys, and the HinksPix and AlphaPix, those are actually web-based integrations. So in those cases, xLights has to kind of simulate what the user is doing. So we have to kind of pretend we're clicking the buttons on the web page. And that sometimes is a lot more error prone because we don't get as well of feedback. So if we screw something up or something doesn't take, xLights may just not upload and you won't really know. So sometimes when we're uploading to some of these controllers, you have to kind of double check that xLights actually worked correctly. So just something to kind of know that the Falcon, the FPP, and those style controllers are a little bit more resilient when it comes to upload, and you'll have less issues with them. So one of the features in xLights is we have this controller discovery button, and I'll demo all this after we talk about it a little bit. The discovery button basically allows you to click this button. xLights will send out a message to your network, and it'll try to discover controllers on your network. So this works really well for like the FPP based. If you have a Falcon and ZCPP mode, it'll also find those. It'll find pixel lights, I believe. I don't have one to test. And it also does ArtNet discovery for certain ArtNet controllers. So if you hit the discovery button, if you have like an FPP based controller, it'll come up and just automatically populate the controller list here. And if it's an FPP or a Falcon, xLights will actually then try to figure out what type of controller it is, and it'll auto set up all the settings for you. So like this is a PB16 controller that I have, and when I auto populate, it automatically turns on the auto layout models, the auto configure upload, and the auto size, and then it sets what type of controller and the vendor and fills this all out for you, kind of like the default state that's better. So, and this next slide here. There's also a kind of an app that Keythroat that's in xLights when you install it. It's only on Windows. You have to go into your C program files, xLights, and just manually launch it. There's no shortcut key, or there's no shortcut on your start in your Windows start menu by default right now. So you have to just start it manually. And this basically is kind of like Angry IP Scanner or Advanced IP Scanner, one of those apps. It'll go through and try to find controllers on your network and identify what they are. One advantage over some of those other ones is if you have like an FPP that's being used as a bridge, it'll actually go through that FPP bridge and try to find controllers. So if you have a separate show network compared to your home network, it'll actually go through that bridge and try to discover the controllers as well. Once you discover them in this app, you still have to kind of manually add them to xLights. There's no auto way to insert them into xLights. So once you have your controller in xLights, if you do the discovery, it'll automatically set this up. But if not, in xLights, you have to manually add the controller, and then you have to fill out the settings related to this. So the most critical thing is kind of the name, and this is what we'll use for like start addressing. The name is only important to you, like how you remember it. If you want to call it, My Cool Controller 1, that's entirely up to you. But I kind of keep mine standard for where they're on my house. And then if I ever change that controller, this name will not change. So if I ever change to a different type of controller for addressing, it's always good to keep that as the same. And then in here, there's other settings. So you have to put in the IP address of the controller or COM port if you're doing like serial. And then there's these the vendor and model drop downs and then variant. That'll set up what type of controller you have. And these are kind of critical to xLights. If you don't set them up, xLights will kind of just assume a generic controller config. But if you set it up to your specific controller, when we go into later settings, like for the models and in the visualizer, this will actually tailor the settings for your controller. So this will help if you try to put too many pixels on a controller. If you actually set the type of controller, xLights will know what's the max pixels, how it can order stuff, how universes have to be set up, and it gives it a more in-depth way of making sure everything's correct. So there are other options if you want to do the channels, like what protocol you want to use, which is kind of critical. Most controllers, we just use E131 or DDP if you're using FPP. And then channels, if you're using auto size, you don't really need to worry about the universe count and the channel count. xLights will automatically do that all for you. So, input protocols, there's kind of 3 or maybe 2. There's a couple of major ones that people use. E131, that's supported by most every controller. So if you want to do E131 for everything, that's pretty easy. A more less common standard is DDP. There are some advantages. DDP allows a lot bigger packet size. So in computer networking, when you send out one packet, it's actually 1,400 bytes. And with DDP, it actually fills all 1,400 of those bytes. When you do E131, it only puts 512 worth of data in each packet. So you're actually wasting about 1/3 of the packet or 2/3 of the packet. So that's why DDP is a lot better for if you're doing a large number of props on a controller. And if you're using like an FPP based, you should really just be using DDP, as that's more efficient. And then there's also like ZCPP, support's really limited on that. So I wouldn't really recommend it unless you have a very specific use case. So when you're thinking about controllers, we need to think about your port configuration and the number of pixels per port. So common controllers out there, you have like the F4, which has 4. You have the Culp F8, which has 8 ports, F16, and so on. They have 16, 32, and then 48 on some of the large. On the Falcon, you can actually do 48 outputs. This is something you need to think about, because then in xLights, this determines how many models we can put on it, or how we distribute our props evenly on the controller. If you have multiple controllers, like I personally in my show have 5 controllers, that makes it looks a lot easier. I'm very controller heavy, so it makes it easier to put props in different locations. You don't have to worry about pixel packing. Most controllers, they do the WS28, 11, 12 pixels by default. The Falcons do they do other protocols too. There's like an APA 102, some other pixels. FPP basically does the 2811. That's the only ones it really does. And then these controllers also, we need to think about the number of pixels we can put on the controller. Depending if you're running at 20 frames a second or 40 frames per second, that's a whole other debate. But I personally run at 40 frames a second. This determines how many pixels you can put on your controller for each port. So the FPP BeagleBone based and Pocket Beagle is about 800. The Falcon is 680 if you're only using one port, and that's on the V3. The V4, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's supposed to be about the same as FPP, so 700 per port. And then the Hinks picks, they're a little less. They're 4 universes, which is 600 and I think 640, 680. And like the Alpha picks is only around 2 universes worth, which is about 340. And then the ESP Pixel Stick is 1 output that can do about 1,000 before you start getting slow down. So another feature a lot of controllers have is serial ports. So most controllers have 1 to 3. Newer ones are kind of getting rid of these a little bit because serial is becoming less popular. The V3 has 3 serial ports, but I know the V4 is only going to have 2. The Hinkspix has 1, and a lot of the Culp controllers, the bigger ones, have 2. Some of the smaller ones only have 1. But these serial ports can be used for DMX outputs. This is a way that you can control, like if you have old Lightorama controllers, we can put them in DMX mode, and we can control those props, your old standard lights, through lower controllers, or if you have Renard controllers, which similarly normally control AC lights. And then you can also control standard DMX devices like moving heads, fog machines, anything like that. Most are limited to one universe of channels, which is 512 channels per output. So if you're using multiple LoRa boxes, you can actually daisy chain them, so you can have multiple 416 LoRa boxes all off that one output and control it. And then if you have multiple outputs, you can do 512 per output normally. So like on the Falcon, you can do 512 channels per the 3 ports on it for multiple boxes. So the easiest way to kind of configure all this after we've done the discovery and put our props and xLights is the visualizer. This is just a way to drag and drop. So on the right side, it'll show all your models, and then you just drag them on the port of the controller. On the left side, it breaks up the ports, and you'll see a little colorization on there. That's to break them up for receivers. If your controller doesn't have receivers, it just does the coloration anyways. It was kind of the lazy way we did it. So it always shows it. So if you just have a 16-port controller, you can kind of ignore those colors if you don't have receivers on them. And in the bottom, you'll see some sliders that allow you to adjust the size of the display. And then the very bottom is kind of a debug information. So every time you adjust a setting in here in the background, xLights will be analyzing your controller configuration. And we go through and trying to find errors. So if you put too many pixels on a port, it'll show up in the bottom. It'll also show up red on the left side to kind of tell you that this isn't possible with your controller. And with the Falcon, it also has the V3. It has the checking for like the Banks configuration. So the Falcon has a very specific use case where you can only do a certain amount of pixels on ports 1 through 16, 17 through 32, and 33 through 48. They all have to be under that 1,000 limit. So built into xLights, it'll automatically do that math in the back end to make sure you're not over that number. So the controller settings here, these are so in xLights, when we add a model, this will be in the layout tab. There's a section called controller connections. These settings, if you never upload to controller, really don't do anything to your sequence. So these are all the settings for the controller specifically. So if you'd adjust a setting in here, when we do an upload to the controller, it'll then it'll change that setting in the controller to match xLights. If you don't ever upload to the controller, these basically do nothing. So this is kind of a way that you can specify all your configuration in xLights, save it, back it up, and then you can just push to your controllers over and over and never have to think about saving your controller settings. So that's kind of the intent behind it. It has things like brightness, null pixels, color order. And if you look in here, there's a checkbox for all the kind of the bottom settings. If they're not checked, we won't actually upload anything, so we won't override what's in the controller. If it's checked, then we will override what's in the controller with the setting in here. So that's the point of the checkboxes. So first one is port, so that's basically the port you're on. And when you do the visualizer, it does this kind of automatically for you. It'll fill in these settings for you, certain ones. But like null pixel and gamma and color order, those you still have to manually do per model. You can't do that in the visualizer. So once we have all our settings set up in xLights and we kind of have everything look good, in the controller tab, there's these options to upload inputs and outputs. And inputs, that'll upload your E131 universes, and it does do sometimes the start channel for like DDP style controllers. Sometimes when you add a controller variant, this will be grayed out. That means that controller doesn't need to do it. Like the AlphaPix controller, it only has the upload output button that'll be colored, so you don't need to do inputs, you only need to do the outputs. And the outputs basically does start channels, the number of pixels on a port, brightness, null pixels, all those settings that we had in the controller page. It'll also do smart receivers if you have that. And there is a feature in your preferences where you can link these two together because they kind of go hand in hand. you normally have to do the inputs first, then the outputs. You can just link these, and then it'll gray out the inputs. And every time you click upload output, it'll actually do both. So if you have this setting linked, it'll just do both automatically, so you don't have to worry about clicking both every time. So that's in the preferences. If you go to file preferences, and you can enable that as well. Well, when we upload the inputs, if we go to our controller, this is a Falcon web page, it'll actually take whatever universes we have specified. And if you have auto size, you kind of just set the first universe and it'll automatically figure out the rest of them, and it'll upload it straight to the controller. So then you don't have to go through here and manually add them. xLights will just add them all for you, and it's kind of a quick way to do it. Similarly with the outputs, this is a BeagleBone based controller. It'll upload all of the configuration for each model. So with the FPP base, it actually goes model by model and puts them all in here and makes what we call virtual strings, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But a lot of controllers don't actually do, like the Falcon, it'll do the description of the first model and then do the pixel count of all the models. So sometimes that's confusing in the Falcon, where it'll say tree 1, but it actually has 10 trees on it. It's only doing the description of the first model. It's not doing all the descriptions. And then some of the older controllers, they don't even have descriptions. They'll just do pixel count and all the settings in there. So I heard this is talking a little bit in the chat about this, and this is kind of what I want to go over. When we do the controller port settings, and we have 3 models like I have here. So on controller port 1, let's say we have a snowflake, a star, and a mini tree. So in xLights, if we set the brightness to 50 on the first model, 30 on the second model, and 20 on the third model, if you have a controller like an AlphaPix or a HinksPix or some of the older style controllers, there's no way in the controller for it to do different brightnesses per model. So what the controller has to end up doing is in xLights, we just take the brightness of the first model, and that's going to be the brightness of all of the models on that controller port. That's kind of a limitation of some of these controllers like the AlphaPix, the SanDevices, the HinksPix. There's no way to do individual brightnesses per model or change settings normally. You have to basically have the same settings for every model on that port. Well, the Falcon and the FPP, they support virtual strings, which this allows in the controller to kind of do virtual settings based on different parts of the data in the buffer, so low level in the controller. So when you change the settings in xLights to be 50, 30, 20, in the controller on that prop, it'll actually do that 50, 30, 20. So those controllers, I think that's a real advantage of getting an FPP-based or a Falcon controller. This virtual string is a lot better, especially if you're doing arches and stuff. Before, you would have to put all your arches on one port if you wanted different brightnesses, like if they were hex arches or something like that. So when you do virtual strings, it's only FPP and Falcon, kind of like I said. It allows you to put model-specific settings on the same port. So in the FPP-based controllers, because they have a lot more RAM and they're a little bit more capable, it actually puts a row for every model, even if you don't change settings. So like in the picture here, even though all these models are 50, it still puts all the models in there to kind of show you start channels, pixel counts, and it breaks out your whole configuration. And if you have a string with multiple brightnesses, you can change that, and the controller will just be able to do that automatically, and it'll work no problem. So this is kind of in the example I'll show. You have an arch where you want that at 100% because it's a hex arch and you want that to be brighter, but then you have a mini tree hooked up to it, and that's direct pixels. You want that to be a little bit dimmer. In the visualizer, we can do the strings like this, and we can set the brightnesses. And then when we upload, it'll upload the 2 different model configurations with the 100% brightness and the 50%. And this is in xLights in the visualizer. When there's virtual strings for an FPP, it'll show in order like this. It won't, and it'll just look pretty normal. There's no real way to tell that we're using virtual strings. The FPP virtual strings are pretty free. They're not very memory intensive, so it's not limiting to the controller. As I'll show here, the Falcon controller, when you do a virtual string, the visualizer will actually make a second line. So if you ever see in xLights in the visualizer why there's 2 lines, this is basically indicating that there's different settings that'll have to make a virtual string in the controller. So on the Falcon here, I did the same thing. We have the arch as 100% and the mini tree as 50. It made 2 lines in the visualizer, and then in the controller, when we upload, it'll also make 2 lines. It'll make the arch, and it'll make the mini tree. I didn't show it here, but if you had like 3 arches that were all the same brightnesses, as I was saying, this top line would have the pixel count of all 3. It wouldn't make lines like the FPP one did. It would just put them all in one line, because the Falcon has a little bit less memory. So he doesn't like to make virtual strings unless he has to. So if they're all the same settings, it won't just automatically make new lines just for the description. It'll keep them all in one line. So just kind of showing in your models here, we have different settings for all these different models. And you'll be able to see them in the window in xLights. And then once we override those settings, so down here we have the checkbox with the 75. You'll see it in the layout here. It'll actually show the overridden settings. And then when we upload to, you'll see the virtual strings here. It put the 75 and the 50 in there. So just wanted to show that. One thing to kind of point out is what I said. So the first model, we set the brightness at 75. And the second model, we didn't set the brightness. So what xLights will do, it'll assume that the next model is still using that 75. So it won't change brightness until you actually say it. So like all the arches in here up to arch 6 are still going to use that 75 setting. That's why it's just one virtual string here. It says arches with 250. That's the 5 arches. 50 times 5 is 250. And then that last arch is 50 on its own virtual string. So that's something to kind of know. If you daisy chain stuff and you set the brightness, adjust the first one, the sequential ones, unless you set them again, will be the same. They will not change back to the default of 100. They'll stay whatever the first one in the line is. And like if you do a SAN device and you set all these brightnesses separate, since the SAN device doesn't do virtual strings and only can do 1 brightness per port, we take the first model on the port and we use that brightness and we just ignore all the other brightnesses. So that's kind of a limitation of some of the older controllers. Alpha picks and the Hinks picks are the same way. We just take the first prop's brightness and use that for the whole controller brightness for that port. It seems like the same slide. Must have been a mistake. Okay, so I want to show some of this in xLights. So I just have a empty show folder here. If I hit the Discover, hopefully, this will find my controller. So I hit Discovery, and kind of how I showed in the slides. This found it's a FPP PB16 controller I have hooked up. It found it automatically. It went out and discovered it on my network. It put in all the settings, and these are kind of the standard. This is gonna suck. These are kind of the standard settings that are in xLights that we kind of recommend for this controller. And if I hit open here, it'll open up my controller. It's currently in remote mode, but then you can get all to the settings automatically. And we'll get back to this once we start playing with this. So I just want to show how to do discovery. I'm going to change show folders here. Just click to another demo folder. So kind of want to show you, I have lots of different controllers set up, and if we hit the visualizer on the FPP based controller, my PB16 I have attached, if we hover over, this will show the settings, and like the demo showed, the brightness of arch 1 is 100 and the mini tree is 50. So since this is an FPP based controller, it's going to show in line. It won't go under like the Falcon. So if I do the visualizer on my Falcon I have hooked up here, you'll see it does 100%, and then it does, and then it'll do the 50 underneath as a separate line. And then I just put another item on here that's 100 on the second port. So if I was to take this arch, and since that's 100 brightness, it'll actually put the first two on the line, and then it'll put this third prop. This is actually kind of confusing in my opinion, because it actually goes arch 2, 4, then mini tree 1 when you wire it, which isn't the greatest. So it's kind of something you have to look at a little bit and figure out. That's why I kind of like the other way better, but this is kind of, it is what it is at this point. So if we were to take this and upload it to, so let's upload to my FPP controller, the PB16 I have hooked up. And if we go to this and go to our channel outputs and go to BBE strings, you'll see kind of what I was saying in the presentation. It'll do arch 1 and mini tree 1 with the 2 settings. So that's that. And for the Hinks picks, I have a mega tree set up on here. And the mega tree, if you look, I have 30% brightness, and then I have the star set at 50. But since the Hinks picks doesn't support virtual strings, when I upload this to the Hinks picks, which this may take a little bit. Oh, I did wake up. Okay, sometimes the Hinks picks is a little slow. After the Hinks picks upload, it also reboots, because for the certain settings to take effect, you have to reboot the controller. So if you open this up right away, you'll get the spinny wheel for about 30 seconds as the controller is rebooting. I have it on my wall. I can see it's rebooting, so it'll be up in a little bit.
Scott, there was a question in chat. Will it discover the LOR controllers on the auxiliary ports?
So the thing to kind of understand with LOR controllers, we're going to hook them up to a serial port. So even though in your mind it's a separate controller, it's still kind of an extension of your main controller. So if you're using an FPP-based controller, it will discover the FPP, but it won't discover what's on its serial ports, because that's kind of like down the line type of it. So it won't really discover. And if you're using like a PIC-C4 or PIC-C16, those we have to use in like either have to use them in DMX mode or using a LOR dongle, and then that's serial, and we don't discover that. But so on my Hinks picks here, I uploaded. Oh shoot, I gotta remember how to use this thing. So I uploaded the mega tree, and what it did on the last port, because we can't do individual brightnesses, it did 30% brightness for all 150. So if we go back to the visualizer here, there's 50 per port, and then port 16 we have 50 for the mega tree, 90 for the star, so that gets us our 140. And as you can tell, it did 140, but it did all of them at 30. There's no way to do individual control on it. So even though in xLights we put that 50, it's basically being ignored, and xLights is just using the mega tree brightness for that port. So I did put in, you can in the visualizer as well, kind of to go with the LOR stuff. If you're doing serial, so if you have like a LOR box or something in DMX mode, in the visualizer you can drag those models on here as well. So in my layout here, I just made a I call it tree superstring. It's using, so in xLights you can set up superstrings, so different colors. So if you had twisted pairs, so if you had like AC lights, you had 3 strings, you had them plugged into a LOR box. So this comes up as 3 channels because it's just 3 colors, and then it's put on DMX because we're using the DMX port on the controller. And then when we go to the visualizer, we just put that on the serial port. That's what we'd hook up to our LOR box, and then we can control those. So that's kind of the basics of that. That's kind of the overview of controller upload. I'll take questions on that maybe at the end here. I want to just go over, hopefully not too quickly, but There's also some other features in xLights specific to certain controllers. So there's the Falcon and the Hinxpix and the FPP base. They support standalone mode. You can run your sequences from those controllers, and xLights will generate sequences for those controllers. So if you're running a Hinxpix or a Falcon, those are kind of sneakernet based, or you have to put your sequences on an SD card and then go put it in the controller. There's no way to upload them over the Ethernet or Wi-Fi. It's very manual. It's very limited, and there are use cases for it if you want to use like a single controller, maybe in a car or something, or a very remote prop. I think there is uses for it, but it's very limited. And then the FPP based is kind of what a lot of people will use. So if you have an FPP master remote, it allows you to upload stuff over Ethernet, Wi-Fi, or if you have, and then it'll put it on the SD card, or it'll put it on a USB stick if you have that in your FPP based controller. And all three of them also support audio. I know on the Hinxpix it's built in with an audio jack. If you have a Pi based FPP, there's an audio jack on there. It doesn't work very well, so I personally use a USB sound blaster. And like my controller and the Culp controller, the PB16, you can also use a USB audio device on those and get audio output. And the Falcon has audio output as well, but you have to get an audio output board from David. He doesn't sell them on his website. They're kind of limited supply, but he will get if you have a use case for them. So how do we generate these files for the controllers? So the FPP, there's the FPP Connect dialog, which when you open this up, it'll find if you're doing master remote, it'll find those controllers, and we can kind of just select what sequences we want to put on there. And there's some settings, and xLights will automatically make the files, the FSCQ, the sequence data files. And if you have the media checked, it'll also put the audio. And then if you have a certain, if you're running like a BeagleBone based controller, so like PB16 or one of the Culps, you can check this box on the end and it'll actually upload the pixel output as well. So basically when we hit the channel, when we upload outputs and inputs, this dialog will do that automatically as well. So you can do it in bulk over all your controllers. And then you just say what sequences you want, and it will, if you're doing master remote, if you're doing the sparse format, it'll only put the channel data for the controller that is required on that channel, and it kind of just does everything for you. So I personally run all FPP stuff, and I really use this feature a lot. It's very great. So if you have a Hinxpix controller that does standalone mode, you can either use, Joe Hinkle makes his HSA software, which you can use, and it has a little bit more capability, but I also in xLights added this export dialog. So in xLights, you can open, it's under the tools menu, Hinxpix export. There's a way where you can basically select what sequences you want, your controller, and the column. So the Hinxpix support with master slave. So using Wi-Fi, they can actually send sync packets between if you have multiple Hinxpix. So you have to select the mode, and then it also can control controllers over E131. So if you wanted to output E131 data to an AlphaPix that you had plugged into the same network, the Hinxpix, it's up to I think 30 universes worth of data. It can also output to 2 of those. So I haven't listed as slave 1, slave 2 here. So you can actually do 2 other controllers. Once you have that all set up, you do the same thing, select your sequences, and then down below, for the Hinxpix, I also kind of make a schedule. So the Hinxpix doesn't have a built-in UI to make a schedule and set the start and end time of sequences. So on the bottom here, I just made a start and end time, and then the up and down arrows on the left here will say the sequence order. So when you check these and do export, this will basically make your playlist order. So if you want to change the order, so cool sequence 2 is before cool sequence 1, you just select it and hit the up and down arrow, and this will make your playlist. And once you export, and then the time will be the time, and it'll make files for Monday through Sunday for your schedule. And right now, I just put this time in there. If you wanted to make it more specific, you could manually go into the files and edit them and make them specific per day. But to just try to make this as simple as possible, it just does it for every day the same by default. And then if you have a F16 V3, they use FSCQ V1 files. So in your file preferences, you can change your sequence output to a V1, and then you would put these files on an SD card, put it into your Falcon, and then the Falcon has its own debug or UI where you would go and set up your schedules and set up your playlists in the controller. You don't have to do it manually on the SD card like with the Hinks. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, that feature is in there as well. And I didn't put it in my slides, but it's a feature that I personally added last year. I have a background in theater lighting, and in theater lighting, you have this concept of hookup lists, or like how you would hook up your lights in your show. So in xLights in the tools last year, I made what I call the controller connections export here. And if I select this, it'll ask me to export a CSV file, which I'll just put in my show folder here. And then if I go to my show folder and open this up, just hit OK, it'll make a list of all the controller connections in my show. So my intent behind this was, if I'm going out there and my brother's helping me set up my lights, he doesn't know what xLights is. He can barely tie his shoes. So how do I tell him where things need to be hooked up? So this is basically a sheet then that you could print out, give to your helpers, and it'll show, okay, on my F16 house left, pixel port 1, here's the first model, here's the second model, and this is how they need to daisy chain them together. And if you have multiple in a line, it would show the whole line. And this is just a way, because when I'm personally outside, I don't have a computer with me, so I can see where I need to hook things up, need to do that. So this is globally for all of the controllers, which I added last year. You can also, in the visualizer, do an export as CSV in here. And this will be controller by controller, which it's the same format, it's just for each individual controller. And you can also print in here as well. I added this print dialog. The printing is a little finicky because it's based on the size of the boxes. So if you change the boxes, like, it'll show up. This will be a pretty boring print because it's only got 2 props on it. Oh, well, that's fancy. Well, I guess that used to work. Maybe it's slow. So, well, I think that might be an issue with PDF printer in Windows. I don't want to figure out right now. So, yeah, I saw that it was 0 bytes there. So, yeah. So that's another feature if you want to just print from here and not do the full patch list. But I do the full patch list, so then I have a huge, I can print that out on and that's why I go to just a CSV with it. Now you can take it into Office if you've got Word or you use LibreCAD. You can, export it, manipulate this as you want. If you only want your helpers to see the first 2 controllers, delete the rest of them. Do all the cool stuff that you want to do. So that's kind of a quick whirlwind view of all of the features that I know of. There's probably more for controllers, but kind of the big important ones that I feel that most users should use and be able to figure out. So are there any questions? I see a couple in chat. So,
hey, Scott.
What's up?
In chat earlier, Joe Hinkle sent you guys the API. Is that true, and are you going to use it?
So yes, I do. I shouldn't say I don't use his API. I use his API for certain things. It's a mix. So I use his API for smart receivers. Right now, I don't use it for the Pixel controller stuff. The smart receiver integration is still very beta. We haven't integrated it yet. It's something that I'm working on. With the new editions of the Falcons, we kind of have to rewrite the smart receiver backend. Kind of how the code is right now, it's very dedicated to using 3 smart receivers, which with the new Falcon, which can in theory use 6 smart receivers, and the Hinkle, which can use 15, we have to kind of redo all that. So He does have an API that I am using ish. I haven't rewritten everything to use it yet. So yeah, I guess I don't want to go to details too much on the list explaining it, but yep.
When you were talking about ports, pixels per port, you listed the F16, the F4. What is a culp?
So the culp is the FPP based controllers. So if you have any of Dan Culp's, these are the BeagleBone based controllers. So if you have any of the K16s, K32s, the F16s, F32s, F8, K8s, those are all BeagleBone / Pocket Beagle based. So those are all the FPP. Or if you're using the controller I designed, the PB16, which is what's in here, it's all the same software, so all the same. Yeah.
Do you have C's on the bottom of the list? When I select auto layout and full xLights control, my channels get mixed up. I have an F16 with a serial port running 2 AC controllers. These are set up for the first 32 channels. I'm just wondering how to get xLights full control.
So that's kind of what I was showing with this serial. I know the mentality of a lot of older, when we used to do a lot of people in xLights before, when you had a Falcon, you did the first universe on a Falcon as your serial, and then you would add other universes as your pixels. You don't really need to do that anymore with the visualizer. So in the visualizer here, so these are my serial ports. So if you had AC controllers, they would be these 2 serial. And what we're actually doing, if you look, this is using start channel 1 and then using start channel 4. So the square box is the DMX start channel, but then if you hover over, it'll actually show the start channel in xLights, and we can show this in the layout as well if we store it. So these first 2 are the DMX. The first 3 actually, because I put the image of a Darth Vader is also a DMX. If you select it and go to type, this will be on the DMX ports, and xLights puts those at the beginning to sort that out. The thing with the auto start channel auto layout is you basically need one controller in here, and then you need to make sure everything is auto start auto layout. You can't try to do one universe of my DMX stuff and then do a second input that's my auto layout. You have to let xLights do everything for that controller and just do one line, and it should then set up everything. If you do it in the visualizer and drag and drop it like this, it should configure it properly.
Question, Scott, from Philip Eberly. Any plans to add plain old multicast controllers to the visualizer?
Yeah, so I saw that the thing with the visualizer is so all the upload stuff assumes we know an IP address. So when you're doing multicast, you don't know the IP address, so it's hard to pair how things are going to be. And when you do multicast, you could in theory be blasting to 4 or 5 controllers. So it's really hard. Like the multicast stuff, once you're kind of doing that, that's kind of in the visualizer is kind of being a quick, easy way for people doing simple configurations. When you're starting to do multicast where you want DMX, like people use multicast where they have one universe go to 4 controllers for just their DMX stuff, that's not really easy to model in xLights from a visual aspect. So we kind of don't we don't go down that road. If you're going to do it, it's a very manual configuration, and you have to go back to the manual mode.
Great answer. John Batten has a question. He experienced a problem with AlphaPix where the serial port will not support a universe greater than 256. Is he thinking about that incorrectly?
I'd be curious if that's an xLights or an AlphaPix problem. I have not tried that, but I do not know.
If anybody has any other questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we will try and get to you.
So I see the question. It's like, if I have a Culp K16, is that a FPP or a BB16? So I kind of group them under FPP, but there's a separate drop down for Culp. Because these Culp lights, different branding, but under the hood, it's the same software on the controller as most of the, like my style controllers. So it's the same capability, but in xLights we have it broken out as a different category just for branding, so a little different. but it's the same capability. The Culps do have more, like they have ADCs and some more of those advanced features. He's got the audio outputs built onto them, where a lot of the other FPP-based ones do not have that. So,
Cool. Jeff C. has a question. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Jeff.
Yeah, so I asked just about the channel configuration. So do I have to select the port as DMX then for the AC channels?
yeah, so if you're doing it manually in here in the layout tab, you would set your protocol as DMX. But if you're in the visualizer, automatically, like even though this is currently set up as WS2011, any of these, if I drag them onto the serial port, it's going to switch it to DMX protocol, and then I'll try to, and it'll tell you it's 270 channels. So if you have any AC props, so in the AC here, I changed the string properties to super strings, which makes it only 3 channels then. So by default, like this line is RGB nodes, which will make it 50. So if it's 50 nodes times 3 because it thinks it's an RGB, this will be 120 channels. If you change this to a superstring or a single color, now this will just be a single channel. If you look, it's 528, 528. So this will make it a single channel. And then when I go to my visualizer, and if I wanted to throw that single line here on, let's say, DMX port 2, now it's going to say, okay, that's protocol DMX, and it starts at channel 2, but it's only 1 channel long now. So that might be, if you're trying to do props, you got to make sure you have the settings right in the layout tab to make sure they're only single channel compared to 3 channel, to make sure it's not like xLights doesn't think it's an RGB pixel where it's 150 channels or something like that.
Okay. Okay, I've got a lot of time to play with it now. Thanks.
Does anybody else have any other questions for Scott while he's here? We still got a few more minutes to go, folks. This is your time. This is one of the developers. You don't get this opportunity often to ask a developer question. So if you got something and you're not sure about it, chime in.
Yeah, I also work on the manual, so if you find mistakes in there, you can message those to me too. There's quite a few, I think, but I don't know if anyone actually reads the manual, so.
JB he posted in chat. He posted in chat, and he was wondering about, have you got time to talk about the video file on, say, on a P5 BBB controller, so you're not pushing it over the show network?
I guess I'm no expert on that. If you put a video file on a BeagleBone, so if you just put the video on there, it'll put it on the HDMI if you have like a Pi or something like that. If you want to just play a video on your BBB, you'll have to put that in xLights, render it to the FSCQ data, and then put that FSCQ on your, if you're using like a pocket scroller or something like that. You can't just put the MP4 and put it on the device. You actually have to render it as sequence data. The only way you can put video files on a FPP, this is my knowledge of it, is if you're using the video output, the HDMI out on it. So if you want to put a video on a matrix, you would put it on with the video effect, render it. It would be in your FSCQ data like everything else. And then if you did like a master remote, you could then put that FSCQ right on that controller, and you wouldn't be then pushing it over the network. So Renard controller I see there. The Falcon has the serial ports. You have to make a crossover cable, and I believe the Falcon has a Renard protocol. So if you open up your Falcon and go to the serial outputs, so you'll have to make a crossover cable. So on ports 2 and 3 on a Falcon, there's jumpers that can do LoRa or DMX. So you could either you would have to basically make a crossover cable so if you did DMX, so this is just the software type. So you would want to do, one common thing you got to make sure is some Renard boxes default to 57600. So you may have to change that. But it'd be the same thing in the visualizer. We can actually, if you wanted, so you can do Renard protocol So let's say this thing we were playing with earlier, we actually want to do. Oh, that's interesting. That may not be correct. That might be a bug there. But you should, in theory, if I drag this, let's change the controller to a Falcon. Let's see if this gives us more options. Yes. So so for this single channel tree I have, or it's actually a 3-channel tree, you can change it. So if you have it on your F16, you can change this to Renard, hit save. And let's change this one to Renard as well. We'll have to change controller. Now if we go to the visualizer, you will see that these now say Renard. And if we upload to the Falcon, it'll change this output page to Renard for wherever we attached it. And then you would just have to make a crossover. So Renard's a pin 4 and 5. I don't remember the parity off the top of my head. You'd have to look it up online. But you'd make a crossover cable. So if you put it in the DMX jumpers, those are pins 1 and 2. You go 1 and 2 to think 4 and 5, make a crossover, and then that's how you would do your Renard off of Falcon. So there's a little bit of hardware to do, but then software, yeah, you would just set. If you're using the visual defaults to DMX when you drag and drop, so you have to manually would go into your layout and set those to Renard first, or it'll just automatically go to DMX. So I hope that covers that.
I don't see any other questions, and we're getting close to the time where we're gonna pull the pin. We definitely want to thank Boscoyo Studio for sponsoring the event, and Wally's Lights for sponsoring the room for us. Definitely a special thank you to Scott Hansen. It's not very often you get one of the developers jumping in here and telling us exactly what's what, because it's fantastic news. Scott's also routine visitor over in the xlights.org Zoom room. So if you're ever having trouble, stop in there, you guys. We certainly want to thank everybody that came out today. And Scott,